Victoria Hartley built the Grand Plaza on perfection and prestige, but secrets hidden beneath its golden facade threatened to destroy her empire. An undercover mission reveals betrayal, loss, and redemption in her quest to reclaim her values. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. Victoria Hartley stood at the window of her penthouse office, looking down at the glittering lights of her flagship hotel, the Grand Plaza. At 55, she had everything a woman could want: power, money, and respect. Her silver-streaked dark hair was perfectly styled, and her designer suit cost more than most people made in a month. But something wasn't right, and she knew it. "Mrs. Hartley, the board meeting starts in 5 minutes, her assistant Margaret reminded her, peering through the door. "Thank you, Margaret. Is Charles ready with the quarterly reports?" "Yes, ma'am, and there's something else. We've received more complaints about the service standards. 3 guests checked out early this morning." Victoria's jaw tightened. This was the 3rd time this week she'd heard about guests leaving early. Her hotels were supposed to be the best in the business. She'd built her empire on the promise of perfection, starting 30 years ago with just one small property and turning it into a chain of luxury hotels that catered to the world's elite. "Tell Charles I want to see those guest satisfaction scores," Victoria said, gathering her papers. "Every single one of them." The board meeting was tense. Charles Peterson, her operations manager, shuffled through his papers nervously as he presented the latest figures. "As you can see, Mrs. Hartley, our revenue is still strong, but guest satisfaction has dropped 15% in the last quarter." Victoria's eyes narrowed. 15%? How did this happen? "We've implemented some cost-cutting measures," Charles explained, tugging at his collar. "Reduced staff in housekeeping, streamlined the cleaning protocols." "Streamlined," Victoria interrupted. "This is the Grand Plaza, not some roadside motel. We don't streamline quality." That's when Sandra Mitchell, her PR director, cleared her throat. "There's something else, Victoria. Social media. Well, there are some posts going viral. Former employees talking about poor working conditions, unfair treatment. It's getting attention." Victoria felt her perfect world starting to crack. She'd always prided herself on running a tight ship, but had she become so focused on the bottom line that she'd lost sight of what really mattered? That night, alone in her luxury apartment, Victoria couldn't sleep. She walked to her home office and started reading through every complaint, every review, every social media post. The words blurred together, but the message was clear. Something was very wrong at the Grand Plaza. Then she saw it. A post from a former housekeeper. "They treat us like we're invisible. Mrs. Hartley talks about world-class service, but she has no idea what really goes on in her hotel. She probably doesn't even know which end of a mop to hold." The words stung, but they sparked an idea. If she wanted to know the truth, she needed to see it for herself. Not as Victoria Hartley, hotel magnate, but as someone invisible. Someone no one would look at twice. The next morning, she called her most trusted friend, Rebecca, who owned a small theater company. "I need your help," Victoria said. "And your discretion. I need to become someone else." Rebecca was surprised but intrigued. "Like in that old show Undercover Boss, you're going to spy on your own hotel." "Not spy," Victoria corrected her. "I'm going to work there, as a cleaning lady. I need to know what's really happening when no one thinks I'm watching." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "You know this is crazy, right? What if someone recognizes you?" "They won't," Victoria said firmly, "because you're going to help me become invisible." Over the next week, Rebecca worked her magic. Victoria's elegant, silver-streaked hair was dyed a mousy brown and styled simply. Colored contacts turned her striking green eyes brown. Special makeup added years to her face and dark circles under her eyes. They practiced walking differently, speaking differently, even choosing clothes from discount stores that Victoria would never have looked at twice before. "Remember," Rebecca said as they finished the transformation, "you're not Victoria Hartley anymore. You're Vicky Martinez, a widow who needs work. You've done some cleaning jobs before, but nothing in a fancy hotel. You're nervous, but determined." Victoria barely recognized herself in the mirror. Gone was the powerful hotel owner. In her place stood a tired-looking woman in her late 50s, wearing practical shoes and a cheap watch. "I've arranged everything through a temp agency," Rebecca explained. "They're sending you to the Grand Plaza tomorrow. Are you sure you want to do this?" Victoria touched her transformed reflection in the mirror. "I've spent 30 years building this company on a promise of excellence. If that promise is being broken, I need to know why, and I need to fix it." What she didn't know was that she was about to uncover more than just dropping service standards. She was about to discover the true cost of success, and it would change her life forever. That night, as Victoria lay in bed, she thought about her late husband, Robert. He'd always told her that true leadership meant getting your hands dirty sometimes. "How you can't run a race if you've never walked the track," he used to say. Tomorrow she would do more than walk the track, she would live it. Little did she know, her perfect life was about to be turned upside down, and the lessons she would learn would shake her world to its very foundation. The morning sun hadn't even risen when Victoria, now Vicky, walked through the employee entrance of the Grand Plaza for the first time. Her heart was pounding as she clutched her cheap plastic bag containing a packed lunch. The same entrance she'd walked past hundreds of times before now felt like a gateway to another world. "You must be the new temp," barked a harsh voice. A heavy-set woman in her 60s with graying hair pulled back severely from her face stood before her. The name tag on her uniform read, "Mrs. Henderson, Head of Housekeeping." "Yes, I'm Vicky Martinez," Victoria said softly, trying to remember to speak with the slight accent she and Rebecca had practiced. Mrs. Henderson looked her up and down with cold eyes. "You're late. Shift starts at 6 a.m. sharp. That means you should be changed and ready to work at 6, not walking in the door." "I'm sorry, Save it. Get changed and meet me in the supply room in 5 minutes. And lose the jewelry." Victoria looked down at her wedding ring, the only piece of her real life she hadn't been able to leave behind. "But 5 minutes!" Mrs. Henderson snapped, walking away. The employee locker room was cramped and smelled of cleaning products. Women of various ages were changing into identical light blue uniforms, chatting in a mix of English and Spanish. Victoria found her assigned locker, a tiny dented metal box, and quickly changed into her uniform. "Don't mind, Mrs. Henderson," said a kind voice beside her. "She's tough on everyone at first." Victoria turned to see a woman about her age with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile. Her name tag read, "Rosa." "I'm Rosa Mendez," the woman said, helping Victoria adjust her uniform. "You'll get used to everything soon enough." "Thank you," Victoria replied, touched by this simple kindness. "I'm Vicky. First time working in a fancy hotel. Is it that obvious?" Rosa laughed softly. "A little, but don't worry. Stick with me. I'll show you the ropes." Their conversation was cut short by Mrs. Henderson's sharp voice calling for morning inspection. 20 women lined up while Mrs. Henderson walked down the line, checking uniforms and appearances with military precision. "Martinez," she barked, stopping in front of Victoria. "Your shoes aren't regulation. Tomorrow you come with proper shoes or you don't come at all, understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Victoria mumbled, looking down at her comfortable but apparently incorrect sneakers. "All right, ladies," Mrs. Henderson announced. "We've got 3 VIP suites checking out today and 6 checking in. I want those rooms perfect. Martinez, you're with Mendez. She'll train you. And remember, if I get any complaints, you'll be out faster than you can say unemployment. Now move." Victoria followed Rosa to a supply cart piled high with cleaning supplies, fresh linens, and amenities. Her stomach churned as she realized she'd never actually cleaned a hotel room before. "Here," Rosa said kindly, handing her a pair of rubber gloves. "First rule, always protect your hands. The chemicals are harsh." For the next hour, Rosa showed Victoria how to clean a room properly. The work was physically demanding, stripping beds, scrubbing bathrooms, vacuuming, dusting, mopping. Victoria's back ached, and her hands felt clumsy with the unfamiliar tasks. 15 minutes per room, Rosa explained. "That's all we get. Unless it's a VIP suite, then we get 20. 15 minutes? Victoria was shocked. "To do all this?" "Welcome to the real world," Rosa smiled sadly. "And we're behind schedule already." As they worked, Victoria began to notice things she'd never seen before. The vacuum cleaners were old and barely worked. The cleaning supplies were cheap and watered down. The staff had to cut corners just to meet their impossible schedule. "Mrs. Henderson," a sharp voice called out. Victoria turned to see Charles Peterson, her operations manager, striding down the hallway. "We need rooms 1201 through 1204 ready in an hour. VIP group checking in early." "But sir," Mrs. Henderson protested, "those rooms just checked out. I need at least 1 hour," Charles cut her off. "Make it happen or find new jobs." Victoria watched in disbelief as Mrs. Henderson turned to the staff, her face red with anger and frustration. "Mendez, Martinez, drop everything and get up to 12, now!" As they rushed to the 12th floor, Victoria saw Rosa wipe away a tear. "What's wrong?" she asked. "My son," Rosa said quietly. "I was supposed to leave early today for his school play. He has the lead role. I promised him I'd be there." Victoria felt sick. She remembered all the times she'd approved streamlining measures without thinking about the real people they affected. The day got worse from there. Victoria watched as a young housekeeper was berated in front of guests for missing a spot on a mirror. She saw Rosa skip her lunch break to help an elderly guest who had fallen, only to be scolded for falling behind schedule. By the end of her shift, Victoria's whole body ached, and her mind was reeling from everything she'd seen. As she changed back into her street clothes, she overheard 2 supervisors talking. "Did you see the memo? They're cutting staff again next month. Orders from the top." "But we're already understaffed." "Tell that to Mrs. Hartley. Like she cares. Probably sitting in her penthouse right now counting her millions." Victoria felt the words like a physical blow. Is that really what her employees thought of her? As she walked to her car, parked several blocks away to maintain her cover, she saw Rosa waiting at the bus stop, still in her uniform. "No ride today?" Victoria asked. "Bus is cheaper," Rosa shrugged. "Every dollar counts when you're raising a kid alone." Victoria watched as Rosa boarded the bus, heading home to a son, whose play she'd missed. Then she got into her own luxury car and drove to her penthouse. But sleep wouldn't come. For the first time in years, Victoria Hartley felt something she hadn't expected. Shame. And this was only day 1. A week had passed since Victoria started. Her undercover job and every day brought new shocking discoveries. This morning she sat in her car, parked in the employee lot, carefully applying the makeup that would transform her into Vicky Martinez. Her muscles ached from the physical work and her hands were getting rough despite the gloves. "Good morning, Vicky," Rosa called out as Victoria walked into the locker room. "You're early today." "I couldn't sleep," Victoria admitted. It was true. She'd been up most of the night thinking about everything she'd seen in the past week. Rosa looked concerned. "Are you okay? You look tired." "I'm fine," Victoria assured her. "How's Miguel? Did he forgive you about missing his play?" Rosa's face fell. "He says he understands, but he's 10. When you're 10, your mama missing your big moment hurts, no matter how good the reason." Before they could talk more, Mrs. Henderson burst into the locker room. "Ladies, emergency meeting in 5 minutes. Everyone in the break room now." The small break room was cramped with all the housekeeping staff squeezed in. Charles Peterson stood at the front, looking smug in his expensive suit. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. She recognized that look from countless board meetings. "Due to recent budget adjustments," Charles announced, "we're implementing new efficiency measures. Starting today, each housekeeper will be responsible for 3 additional rooms per shift. Also, breaks will be reduced to 20 minutes. A murmur of protest went through the room. "That's impossible," someone called out. "We can barely manage our current loads." Charles's face hardened. "This isn't a negotiation. Either adapt to the new requirements or find another job. There are plenty of people who would love to work at the Grand Plaza." Victoria watched as Rosa's shoulders slumped. She knew her friend was already exhausted trying to keep up with the current workload. Later, as they cleaned rooms together, Victoria heard something that made her blood run cold. "Did you approve these new cleaning products?" one supervisor asked. Another, thinking they were alone in the service corridor. "They're half the price of the old ones," the other replied. "Peterson says it's coming straight from Mrs. Hartley's office." "Who cares if they don't work as well? The guests won't know the difference." Victoria felt sick. She had never approved any such change. Someone was making decisions in her name, cutting corners and risking the hotel's reputation. During lunch, break now shortened to 20 minutes, Victoria sat with Rosa in a quiet corner of the break room. She noticed Rosa wasn't eating. "Aren't you hungry?" Victoria asked. Rosa shook her head. "Saving my lunch for Miguel. The school lunch program got cut, and food's expensive. He's a growing boy. He needs it more than I do." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. She reached into her bag and pulled out her sandwich. "Please take half of mine. I'm not very hungry." Rosa tried to refuse, but Victoria insisted. As they shared the sandwich, Rosa opened up about her life. "I used to have dreams, you know," she said softly. "I wanted to be a chef. I even took some classes at the community college. But then Miguel's father left and, well, dreams don't pay the bills." Before Victoria could respond, they heard raised voices from the corridor. Through the break room's open door, they saw a guest shouting at a young housekeeper named Maria. "This room is filthy," the man yelled, waving at his suite door. "I'm paying $500 a night for this." Charles Peterson appeared quickly, all smooth charm and apologies. "I'm so sorry for your inconvenience, sir. Please accept a complimentary upgrade to one of our luxury suites." After the guest left, Charles turned on Maria. "This is unacceptable. You're fired. Clean out your locker immediately." "But Mr. Peterson," Maria pleaded, "I cleaned that room exactly like you told us to. With the new products, clean out your locker," Charles repeated coldly, "or I'll have security escort you out." Victoria watched as Maria ran away, crying. Rosa started to get up, but Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway. "Break's over, ladies. Back to work." That afternoon, Victoria overheard another conversation that made her realize just how deep the corruption went. She was cleaning the executive conference room when Charles Peterson and another manager walked in, not noticing her in the corner. "Mrs. Hartley won't know the difference," Charles was saying. "We'll tell her the new cleaning supplies are eco-friendly. Meanwhile, we pocket the difference and everyone's happy." "What about the staff complaints?" Charles laughed. "Since when does Victoria Hartley care about the help? As long as her profit margins look good, she never asks questions." Victoria's hands shook as she gripped her cleaning cloth. She wanted to reveal herself right there, to confront them, but she knew she needed more evidence. She needed to understand just how far this corruption went. At the end of the shift, Victoria found Rosa crying in the locker room. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting next to her friend. "Miguel's school called. He's sick, but I can't leave to pick him up. If I miss any more time, they'll fire me. And now with these new quotas," Rosa wiped her eyes. "Sometimes I think Mrs. Hartley must really hate people like us to make us work like this." Victoria felt her heart breaking. "Don't say that. Maybe she doesn't know." Rosa gave a bitter laugh. "Of course she knows. She owns everything, but people like her, they don't see people like us. We're just numbers on a spreadsheet to them." As Victoria drove home that night, she made a decision. It wasn't enough just to observe anymore. She needed to act. But first, she needed proof. Proof of every lie, every scheme, every betrayal being committed in her name. What she didn't know was that her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone at the Grand Plaza forever. Victoria couldn't sleep that night. She kept thinking about Charles Peterson using her name to cheat and steal, about Rosa going hungry so her son could eat, about Maria being fired for following orders. In her luxurious penthouse, she felt like a fraud. The next morning, she arrived at work early, hiding a small voice recorder in her uniform pocket. If Charles and the others were stealing from her hotel and hurting her employees, she would get proof. "You look determined today," Rosa said as they loaded their cleaning cart. "Everything okay?" "Just thinking about what you said yesterday," Victoria replied. "About Mrs. Hartley not seeing us." Rosa touched her arm gently. "I'm sorry if I upset you. Sometimes I get angry and say things." "No," Victoria interrupted. "You were right. Someone needs to make her see." They started their morning rounds, but today was different. Victoria noticed things she hadn't before, how the managers always disappeared into their offices when corporate visitors came, how certain rooms were marked as special handling only. During their break, Victoria pretended to clean near Peterson's office. The voice recorder caught everything. "The kickbacks from the supply company are better than we expected," Charles was saying to someone on the phone. "Mrs. Hartley's too, busy with her society friends to check the books. By the time anyone notices, we'll be rich." Victoria's hands shook as she pushed her cleaning cart away. She had trusted Charles for years. How long had he been stealing from her? How many other managers were involved? Later that afternoon, something happened that would change everything. A young woman checked into the hotel with two small children. Victoria and Rosa were assigned to clean the room next door. "Please," the woman begged at the front desk. "I know it's early, but we've been driving all night. The children are exhausted. If we could just check in now." The desk manager, James Collins, smiled coldly. "Check-in is at 3 p.m. However," he lowered his voice, "for an additional $100, I might be able to arrange something." Victoria watched the tired mother, a dig through her purse, hands trembling. She could see the woman counting out crumpled bills while her children slumped against her legs. "Disgraceful," Rosa muttered beside her. "They do this all the time. Extra charges for early check-in, fees for special requests. Most of it goes straight into their pockets. You've seen this before? Many times. Last week, an old man needed a wheelchair. They charged him $50 to borrow one for an hour. The wheelchairs were donated to the hotel for guest use." Victoria felt rage building inside her. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about basic human decency. That evening, Victoria stayed late, pretending to do extra cleaning. She waited until most of the staff had left, then used her cleaning cart to prop open the door to the accounting office. Inside, she found file cabinets full of evidence: fake invoices, doubled charges, kickback records. She was so focused on taking pictures with her phone that she didn't hear someone coming until it was almost too late. She barely managed to hide behind a filing cabinet when Mrs. Henderson walked in. "I'm telling you," Mrs. Henderson was saying into her phone, "Peterson's getting greedy. These new quotas are impossible. Someone's going to get hurt." Victoria held her breath, listening. "No, I haven't told anyone. But I've kept records of everything. Every dirty deal, every bribe. I'm not going down alone if this falls apart." After Mrs. Henderson left, Victoria sat on the floor of the dark office, her heart pounding. Even Mrs. Henderson, who seemed so loyal to management, was part of the corruption. The next morning, Victoria noticed something was wrong as soon as she arrived. Rosa's eyes were red from crying. "What happened?" Victoria asked, pulling her friend aside. "Miguel's school called again. He's getting worse, high fever. But Peterson denied my request for sick leave. He said if I leave, I shouldn't bother coming back." Victoria felt something snap inside her. "Take the day, Rosa. Go to your son." "But I'll lose my job." "Some things are more important than a job. Go, I'll cover for you." Rosa hugged her tightly. "Thank you, Vicky. You're a true friend." As Rosa hurried away, Victoria squared her shoulders. She had enough evidence now. It was time to end this. But before she could act, she overheard something that chilled her to the bone. Two managers were talking in the service corridor. "Peterson's called an all-staff meeting for tomorrow," one said. "They're announcing major layoffs, half the housekeeping staff at least. But we're already understaffed." "Doesn't matter, they've got a plan to replace most of them with a cheaper cleaning service. Peterson says he's got Mrs. Hartley's full approval." Victoria felt her blood boil. Not only had they been stealing from her and abusing her employees, but now they were planning to fire people like Rosa, hard-working people who depended on these jobs to survive. She walked to the employee bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman who stared back wasn't Vicky Martinez anymore. The dyed hair and colored contacts couldn't hide the fire in her eyes. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow at the all-staff meeting, Victoria Hartley would return, and heads would roll. What she didn't know was that Charles Peterson had his own plans for tomorrow's meeting. Plans that would turn everything upside down and put someone's life in danger. The storm was about to break, and the Grand Plaza would never be the same. The morning of the staff meeting dawned grey and stormy, matching Victoria's mood perfectly. She arrived early, dressed in her cleaning uniform for what she knew would be the last time. In her bag, she carried everything she needed: the voice recorder, the photos of fake invoices, and her real ID. Rosa was waiting by her locker, looking worried. "Vicky, thank God you're here. Miguel's doing better, but now everyone's talking about this meeting. They say there are going to be layoffs." Victoria hugged her friend tightly. "Whatever happens today, Rosa, remember that you're a good person. And good people eventually win. Rosa looked confused. What do you mean, you're acting strange? Before Victoria could answer, Mrs. Henderson's voice boomed through the locker room. Everyone to the grand ballroom, now! The grand ballroom, usually reserved for wealthy guests and expensive parties, was packed with hotel staff. Housekeepers, maintenance workers, kitchen staff, and desk clerks all stood nervously, whispering among themselves. Victoria felt sick seeing how many lives were about to be affected. Charles Peterson stood at the front of the room, looking smug in an expensive new suit. Next to him was James Collins from the front desk, and several other managers Victoria now knew were part of the corruption. Good morning, everyone, Charles began with a fake smile. We've called you here today to announce some exciting changes. At the Grand Plaza, Victoria moved closer to the front, her heart pounding. As you know, Charles continued, Mrs. Hartley has always believed in running an efficient business. To that end, we've reviewed our staffing needs and decided to make some adjustments. A murmur of fear went through the crowd. Victoria saw Rosa, clutching her cleaning uniform, tears in her eyes. Effective immediately, Charles announced, we will be outsourcing our housekeeping department. All current housekeeping staff will be terminated, with 2 weeks severance pay. The room erupted in shocked cries and protests. Victoria saw Mrs. Henderson smirking in the corner, probably already assured of her own position. This decision comes directly from Mrs. Hartley herself, Charles added smoothly. She feels... No, a clear voice rang out. She doesn't. Every head turned as Victoria stepped forward. She reached up and removed her brown wig, letting her silver-streaked dark hair fall free. She wiped away the makeup that had added years to her face and took out her colored contacts. Hello, Charles, she said coldly. Surprised to see me? The color drained from Charles's face. Behind her, Victoria heard Rosa gasp. Vicky, my name is Victoria Hartley, she announced to the stunned room, and I have spent the last 2 weeks working as a housekeeper in my own hotel. What I've discovered makes me sick. Charles tried to recover. Mrs. Hartley, I can explain. Save it, Victoria snapped. She turned to address the crowd. These men have been stealing from the hotel and abusing their positions. They've been taking bribes, charging guests illegal fees, and pocketing the money. They've been cutting corners on cleaning supplies and forcing you to work in impossible conditions. She held up her phone. I have proof of everything. Every crooked deal, every kickback, every lie. And I've already sent copies to the police and my lawyers. Charles suddenly lunged for the door, but security guards, quietly called in advance by Victoria, blocked his way. You can't do this, he shouted. You'll never prove anything. Actually, Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, pulling out a thick folder. She can. I've kept records of everything, Charles. Everything. Victoria nodded at Mrs. Henderson. They'd talked earlier that morning, making a deal. In exchange for turning over evidence and testifying against Charles and his conspirators, Mrs. Henderson would keep her job, though with strict oversight. I trusted you, Charles, Victoria said sadly. I trusted all of you, and you betrayed that trust. But worse than that, you betrayed these people. She gestured to the staff. The people who actually make this hotel work. She turned to face her employees. I owe you all an apology. I lost sight of what matters. I forgot that a hotel isn't just buildings and balance sheets. It's people. Every one of you matters. Rosa stepped forward, tears in her eyes. All this time, you were Mrs. Hartley. Victoria took her friend's hands. I was. And I learned more from you about dignity and hard work than I have in 30 years of running hotels. I'm so sorry about Miguel's play. Turning back to the crowd, Victoria raised her voice. There will be changes at the Grand Plaza starting today, but not the ones Mr. Peterson announced. She began listing her decisions. All housekeeping staff will receive an immediate 20% raise. Schedules will be adjusted to allow reasonable time to clean rooms properly. Full health benefits for all full-time employees. And a new educational assistance program, because everyone deserves a chance to follow their dreams. The room burst into applause and cheers. Security officers were leading Charles and his conspirators away. Mrs. Henderson was already directing staff to return to their posts. There was still a hotel to run. Rosa still stood there looking stunned. I told you Mrs. Hartley was a terrible person, that she didn't care about us. Victoria smiled sadly. You were right about me then. but I'm trying to be better now." She paused. "How would you feel about moving to the kitchen staff? I seem to remember something about dreams of being a chef." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "You mean it? We'll start you in prep work, with full training. It won't be easy, but—" She was cut off as Rosa hugged her tightly. The storm outside was clearing, and sunlight began streaming through the ballroom's windows. But Victoria knew this was just the beginning. She had a hotel to rebuild, trust to regain, and a lot of wrongs to right. As she watched her employees return to work, with new hope in their steps, she made a silent promise. The Grand Plaza would become what it always should have been, not just a luxury hotel, but a place where everyone, guest and employee alike, was treated with dignity and respect. And it would start today. The news of what happened at the Grand Plaza spread like wildfire. By evening, TV reporters were camped outside the hotel, all wanting to talk to Victoria Hartley, the billionaire owner who went undercover as a cleaning lady in her own hotel. But Victoria had more important things to do than give interviews. She sat in her office, not the luxury penthouse suite anymore, but a simpler office on the main floor where employees could easily find her, meeting with her staff one by one. Mrs. Hartley, Rosa knocked on the open door, still wearing her housekeeping uniform. "You wanted to see me? Come in, Rosa," Victoria smiled. "And please, after everything we've been through, call me Victoria." Rosa sat down nervously. "It still feels strange. Every time I think about all the things I said about you." "You said what you believed was true," Victoria interrupted gently. "And you were right about a lot of things. That's why I need your help now." She pulled out some papers from her desk. "I meant what I said about the kitchen position. Head chef Martinez has agreed to take you on as an apprentice. You'll start with basic prep work, but with training and hard work, you could be a chef within 2 years. Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Victoria smiled. "The hours will work better with Miguel's school schedule, and the pay is better too. Speaking of Miguel," she pulled out another paper. "I called his school. They have an excellent after-school program, including tutoring. It's all arranged if you want it." Rosa burst into tears. Victoria got up and hugged her friend. Because that's what they were now, friends. "Why are you doing all this?" Rosa asked. "Because everyone deserves a chance to follow their dreams," Victoria replied. "And because you showed me kindness when you thought I was just a cleaning lady. That means something." Later that afternoon, Victoria called a meeting with her remaining managers. Mrs. Henderson was there, looking nervous but determined in her new role as Staff Relations Director. "The changes start now," Victoria announced. "I want new schedules drawn up giving housekeeping staff proper time to clean rooms, order the best cleaning supplies, no more cutting corners, and I want a complete review of all employee wages and benefits." "But Mrs. Hartley," one manager protested, "all this will cost—" "Yes, it will cost money," Victoria interrupted. "Money well spent. I'd rather make less profit and run a hotel I can be proud of." That evening, Victoria visited every department, talking to staff, listening to their concerns. In the kitchen, she found Rosa already in her new chef's whites, chopping vegetables with a huge smile on her face. "How does it feel?" Victoria asked. "Like a dream," Rosa beamed. "Chef Martinez says I have good knife skills, and Miguel is so excited about the after-school program." But not everything was smooth sailing. The next morning, Victoria's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Other hotel owners were angry that she was raising wages. It would make them look bad. Some wealthy guests threatened to take their business elsewhere if she kept catering to the help. "Let them go," Victoria told her assistant. "We'll build a new kind of luxury, one based on treating everyone with respect." A week after the big reveal, Victoria was working late in her office when she heard a knock. It was Mrs. Henderson. "The police need to know if you want to press charges against Charles Peterson and the others," she said. "They've found even more evidence of theft and fraud," Victoria nodded firmly. "Yes, they need to face consequences, but make sure all the staff they hurt get a chance to testify too." As Mrs. Henderson turned to leave, she paused. "Why did you give me a second chance?" "Because you kept those records," Victoria replied. "Part of you knew it was wrong, and because everyone deserves a chance to do better, including me. That night, Victoria walked through her hotel, really seeing it for the first time. She saw housekeepers who now had time to do their jobs properly, wearing new uniforms they could be proud of. She saw Rosa teaching Miguel how to make pasta in the kitchen while he did his homework. She saw guests being treated with genuine warmth by staff who felt valued and respected. But she also saw challenges ahead. Charles Peterson was threatening to sue. Some guests were complaining about slightly higher rates, and Victoria knew that changing a culture wouldn't happen overnight. In her old penthouse office, now converted into a staff training center, Victoria found a framed photo of herself from 20 years ago when she first bought the Grand Plaza. She took it down and replaced it with a new photo, one of her entire hotel staff, taken the day after her big reveal. In it, she stood among her employees wearing a simple business suit, her arm around Rosa, both of them smiling. "The Grand Plaza is changing," she told a reporter who caught her leaving work that evening. "We're becoming what we always should, have been, a place where luxury means treating everyone, guest and employee alike, with dignity and respect." As she drove home that night, Victoria thought about how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had lost some things, her pristine public image, some wealthy clients, the illusion of control. But she had gained so much more: real friends, a true understanding of her business, and most importantly, her self-respect. What she didn't know was that her biggest challenge was still to come. Because Charles Peterson wasn't just planning a lawsuit, he was planning revenge. And he knew secrets about the Grand Plaza that even Victoria didn't know. Charles Peterson sat in his expensive lawyer's office, his face twisted with anger as he watched the morning news. The story about Victoria Hartley's undercover mission was everywhere, and people were calling her a hero. "She ruined me," he snarled, turning off the TV. 30 years in the hotel business, and now I'm facing criminal charges. She'll pay for this." His lawyer, Richard Maxwell, looked concerned. "Be careful, Charles. Mrs. Hartley has evidence of your crimes. Revenge could make things worse." Charles smiled coldly. "Oh, but I have evidence too. Evidence that would destroy not just Victoria, but the Grand Plaza itself." He pulled out an old file from his briefcase. And it's time everyone knew the truth about the great Victoria Hartley. Meanwhile, at the Grand Plaza, Victoria was starting her day with a staff breakfast, a new tradition she'd started to stay connected with her employees. Rosa was there, proudly serving omelets she'd learned to make in her chef training. "These are amazing," Victoria told her friend. "You're a natural." "Thanks to you," Rosa beamed. "Miguel got an A on his math test yesterday. The tutoring program is really helping." Their happy moment was interrupted when Margaret, Victoria's assistant, rushed in, looking worried. "Mrs. Hartley, you need to see this." She handed Victoria a letter. It was from Charles Peterson's lawyer, demanding a private meeting. He claims to have information that could devastate the hotel's reputation. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. What kind of information? He wouldn't say, but he wants to meet today. Victoria looked around at her staff, at Rosa's concerned face, at the housekeepers enjoying a proper breakfast break, at the new sense of family they were building. She wouldn't let Charles destroy this. "Set up the meeting," she told Margaret. "But have our lawyers there too." Later that morning, Victoria sat in the hotel's conference room, facing Charles Peterson and his lawyer. Charles looked different now. His expensive suit was slightly wrinkled, and his eyes had a desperate gleam. "What do you want, Charles?" Victoria asked coldly. "Drop the charges against me," he demanded. "Give me a generous severance package, or everyone learns the truth about what happened here in 1995. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. 1995, the year she bought the Grand Plaza, the year everything changed. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice shook slightly. Charles smiled. "No? Let me refresh your memory. A mysterious fire in the old service wing, insurance money that helped a struggling young widow buy her first hotel, records that disappeared. Ring any bells?" Victoria's lawyers jumped in, trying to end the meeting, but she held up her hand. "How did you find out?" "I've been here longer than you, Victoria. I know where all the bodies are buried, sometimes literally." After Charles left, Victoria sat alone in her office, her hands trembling. The past she'd tried so hard to forget was coming back to haunt her. She'd done things she wasn't proud of, things she'd justified because she was desperate and alone. A knock at her door made her jump. It was Rosa. "Victoria, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Victoria managed a weak smile. "Just tired. The changes are challenging." But Rosa knew her friend too well now. "It's more than that. What did Peterson want?" Before Victoria could answer, Mrs. Henderson burst in. "Mrs. Hartley, someone leaked personnel files to the press. Private information about salaries, complaints, everything. It's all over social media." Victoria's phone started ringing. News outlets wanting comments. Angry employees whose private information was exposed. Guests cancelling reservations. "How did this happen?" Victoria demanded. Mrs. Henderson looked grim. "The files were accessed using your old password. Someone's trying to make it look like you did this." Victoria knew exactly who that someone was. Charles was making his move, trying to turn her own staff against her. But this was just the beginning. She could feel it. "Call everyone to the ballroom," she told Mrs. Henderson. "It's time for the truth." "The whole truth?" Mrs. Henderson asked quietly. And Victoria knew she was thinking of 1995 too. "No," Victoria whispered. "Not yet. They're not ready for that. I'm not ready for that." As she walked to the ballroom, Victoria felt the weight of her past pressing down on her. She'd built the Grand Plaza on a foundation of secrets, and now those secrets threatened everything she'd worked to rebuild. What she didn't know was that Charles Peterson had already put an even more dangerous plan in motion. Because he hadn't just leaked files, he'd hired someone to look into the mysterious fire of 1995. And what they found would change everything. In the kitchen, Rosa watched her friend walk past, seeing the worry on Victoria's face. She wanted to help but didn't know how. Then she noticed something strange. A maintenance worker she'd never seen before taking pictures of the old service wing blueprints. "Excuse me," she called out. "Can I help you?" The man quickly folded the blueprints. "Just routine inspection," he said, hurrying away. Rosa felt uneasy. Something was wrong at the Grand Plaza. Again. And this time the threat wasn't just to their jobs, it was to Victoria herself. As the staff gathered in the ballroom, thunder rolled outside. Another storm was coming to the Grand Plaza, and this one threatened to expose secrets that could destroy them all. Victoria stood in the old service wing of the Grand Plaza, her flashlight beam dancing across walls that hadn't been used since the fire of 1995. Everything had been sealed off, marked as unsafe for occupancy, but she knew the real reason this part of the hotel stayed closed. It held too many secrets. "Mrs. Hartley," Rosa's voice made her jump. "What are you doing down here?" Victoria quickly switched off her flashlight. "Just checking some old records. But what brings you here?" "I saw something strange earlier," Rosa said. "A man in maintenance uniform, taking pictures of the old blueprints. When I asked him about it, he ran away." Victoria felt her heart race. What did he look like? Tall, grey hair, had a scar on his right hand. Rosa paused. "Wait, how did he get those blueprints? I thought all the old records were sealed." Before Victoria could answer, they heard footsteps. They ducked behind some old crates as the beam of another flashlight swept past. Through the darkness, they could hear two men talking. "This is where it started," a familiar voice said. "Charles Peterson. The fire began right here in the old electrical room, but it wasn't an accident, was it, Frank?" Victoria's blood ran cold. Frank Martinez, the former maintenance chief, who'd retired right after the fire, the man who knew everything. "I kept my mouth shut for 30 years, Frank's gruff voice replied, but seeing her on TV, acting all holy and righteous, maybe it's time people knew the truth about Victoria Hartley. Rosa looked at Victoria in confusion, but Victoria pressed a finger to her lips. They needed to hear this. The insurance money from that fire is what gave her the down payment to buy this place, Charles continued. Amazing how all the inspection records disappeared, isn't it? Along with the security footage. She was desperate back then, Frank said. Young widow, no money, big dreams. Amazing what people will do when they're desperate. Victoria closed her eyes, memories flooding back. She'd been so young, so alone after Robert's death. The Grand Plaza had been failing under its previous owner. The insurance money from the fire had given her the chance to buy it, to turn it around. She'd told herself no one had been hurt, that sometimes the end justified the means. "Got what you need?" Charles asked. "All on tape," Frank replied. "Every detail about that night. Think the police will be interested." Their footsteps faded. Away. Victoria stayed frozen in place, her whole body shaking. "Victoria." Rosa's voice was gentle. "What was that about?" "Not here," Victoria whispered. "My office." Upstairs, Victoria poured herself a drink with trembling hands. Rosa sat quietly, waiting. "I did a terrible thing," Victoria finally said. "I was 25, newly widowed, working as an assistant manager here. The hotel was failing. The owner wanted to tear it down, fire everyone. I had an idea. A terrible idea." "The fire," Rosa said softly. Victoria nodded. "It was supposed to be small, just enough for insurance money. No one was supposed to get hurt. Frank helped me set it up. He needed money for his sick wife's medical bills, but the fire spread faster than we expected. Everyone got out, but there was a homeless man who sometimes slept in the service wing. We didn't know he was there until..." Victoria's voice broke. Rosa sat in shocked silence. "The police ruled it an accident," Victoria continued. "The insurance paid out. I bought the hotel, saved everyone's jobs, built all this. I told myself it was worth it, that one tragedy prevented many others. But I've carried that guilt for 30 years. Suddenly, Mrs. Henderson burst into the office. "Mrs. Hartley, Channel 5 News is running a story about criminal allegations against you. They're talking about a fire in 1995. Victoria's phone started ringing. She saw the caller ID, her lawyer. "What do we do?" Mrs. Henderson asked. Victoria looked at Rosa, expecting to see disgust or judgment. Instead, she saw compassion and determination. "First," Rosa said firmly, "we find out who else knew about this. Charles and Frank couldn't have discovered all this alone." Victoria felt a glimmer of hope. You're not disgusted with..." "Me? We all have a past," Rosa said. "You gave me a second chance. Maybe it's time you gave yourself one too." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "The staff deserves to hear it from you, not the news. And we need to get ahead of whatever Charles is planning." Victoria took a deep breath. "Call everyone together again, but first..." She picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd never forgotten. "Hello, Frank. We need to talk about the real story of that night. Because there was something Charles didn't know, something Victoria had kept secret, even from herself. The real reason the fire had spread so fast. The real reason she'd felt such crushing guilt. And somewhere in the Grand Plaza, in a hidden corner of the old service wing, evidence of that truth still waited to be found. Evidence that could either save Victoria or destroy her completely." Thunder rolled again outside. In his expensive apartment across town, Charles Peterson watched the news coverage with a satisfied smile. But he didn't know that his perfect revenge plan was about to uncover secrets even he wasn't prepared for. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, no matter how deep you try to hide it. And sometimes the truth is even more explosive than the lies we tell ourselves. The staff gathered in the ballroom for the third time in 2 weeks. This time the mood was different. Everyone had seen the news. Whispers about the 1995 fire filled the room. Victoria stood at the front, feeling every eye on her. "Before I tell you my story," she began, "I want you to hear from someone else first." Frank Martinez walked into the room. He looked older than Victoria remembered, his hair completely gray now, that scar on his hand faded with time. The former maintenance chief looked nervous but determined. "I made a deal with Charles Peterson," Frank admitted to the crowd. "He offered me money to tell what I knew about the fire. But I can't live with another lie. You all deserve the whole truth." Victoria held her breath. Even she didn't know everything about that night. Frank's voice shook as he spoke. "Mrs. Hartley didn't start that fire. I did, without her knowledge." Gasps filled the room. Victoria stared at Frank in shock. "The hotel was failing," Frank continued. "The owner back then, Mr. Harrison, was planning to demolish it. My wife was dying. I needed money for her treatments. I thought a small insurance fire would solve everything. Mrs. Hartley caught me that night, tried to stop me. But it was too late. Victoria felt the room spinning as memories flooded back. She'd found Frank in the service wing, matches in hand. They'd argued. She'd tried to grab the matches. The fire spread so fast, Frank's voice cracked. We didn't, for no someone was sleeping in there. Mrs. Hartley ran in trying to save him. She almost died herself. More memories hit Victoria. The heat, the smoke, finding the homeless man unconscious. The burning beam that fell, trapping them both until firefighters arrived. Afterward, Frank continued, Mrs. Hartley made a choice. She took the blame. Said if anyone found out, she'd say it was her idea. She protected me so I could stay and care for my dying wife. The guilt ate at her while I kept silent. Rosa stood up. But why come forward now? Because Charles Peterson found out part of the truth, but not all of it. He's trying to destroy Mrs. Hartley with half the story. I won't let that happen. Victoria stepped forward, her legs shaking. I could have told the truth back then, but Frank's wife needed him, the staff needed their jobs. When the insurance money came, I had a choice, walk away or use it to save the hotel. I chose to stay, to build something. Good from something terrible. I told myself that made it right. Mrs. Henderson spoke up from the back. That's why you always kept the old wing closed. Not because it was unsafe, because it reminded me of the cost of pride, Victoria finished. I was so proud of building this place I never admitted how it started. Even when I thought it was my fault, I kept silent. Pride again. Suddenly, the ballroom doors burst open. Charles Peterson strode in, followed by police officers. How touching, he sneered. But too late. I've already given the police evidence. Of your crime, Frank stepped forward. No, Charles, you've given them evidence of my crime. And I've just confessed to all these witnesses. Charles's face turned red. You're lying to protect her. No, a new voice said. Everyone turned to see an elderly man in a wheelchair being pushed in by Rosa. He's telling the truth. I'm the proof. Victoria gasped. Mr. Jenkins. The homeless man from that night, the one they thought had died, was very much alive. Found him in a nursing home across town, Rosa explained. Took some detective work, but... Mr. Jenkins smiled gently. I've been following your story, Mrs. Hartley, reading about all the changes you're making here. Think it's time everyone knew how you saved my life that night. The police officers looked confused. Charles looked desperate. This doesn't change. Anything, he shouted. The insurance fraud. Actually, Mrs. Henderson interrupted, pulling out a familiar-looking file. I found the original insurance report. The company knew about Frank's role. They paid out because Mrs. Hartley saved a life at risk of her own. Everything was legal. Charles looked around wildly, seeing his revenge plan crumbling. You're all lying. She's fooled you all, just like she fooled me. I worked here for 30 years, thinking I was building something while she... What? Rosa demanded. While she took the blame for someone else? While she saved people's jobs? While she put others before herself? Sounds like you're the only fool here, Mr. Peterson. Victoria held up her hand for silence. Charles, I did wrong by you too. I got so caught up in success. I forgot about the people who helped build this place. That's why you turned to stealing. You felt cheated. I understand that now. Don't you dare pity me, Charles snarled, but tears were forming in his eyes. It's not pity, Victoria said softly. It's understanding. We all make choices we regret. The question is, what do we do after? The police officers stepped forward. One spoke quietly to Victoria and Frank, while another took Charles aside. Later that evening, after statements had been given and the press had finally left, Victoria sat in her office with Rosa and Mrs. Henderson. Frank won't face charges, Victoria told them. Too much time has passed, and he confessed voluntarily. Charles, however, he'll have to answer. For his crimes, Mrs. Henderson nodded. The recent ones, at least. Rosa touched Victoria's hand. Are you okay? Victoria smiled tearfully. You know what? I think I am. For the first time in 30 years, I feel free. But their moment of peace was interrupted by Margaret rushing in. Mrs. Hartley, you need to see this, she handed Victoria. A tablet showing breaking news. Victoria read the headline and felt her blood run cold. Grand Plaza scandal deepens, Former owner Harrison claims hotel built on stolen legacy. Because even as one secret came to light, another darker one was emerging. And this one went back even further than 1995, back to the very foundations of the Grand Plaza itself. The past, it seemed, wasn't finished with Victoria Hartley yet. Victoria stared at the news headline about the Grand Plaza's stolen legacy, her hands shaking as she clicked the link to read more. The article showed a photo of Jonathan Harrison, the hotel's former owner, standing in front of old blueprints. "The Grand Plaza was my father's dream," Harrison claimed in the article, "but he was cheated out of it by his business partner, who then sold it to me under pressure. I later sold to Victoria Hartley, not knowing the hotel's dark history. The truth must finally come." "Hout?" Rosa put a comforting hand on Victoria's shoulder. "What does he mean?" "I don't know," Victoria whispered. "I bought the hotel from Harrison fair and square. I never knew—" Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. "Actually, I think I might know something about this." She pulled an ancient-looking leather folder from her bag. "I found this hidden in the old wing while we were gathering evidence about the fire. I was waiting for the right time. Inside the folder were yellowed documents and faded photographs." Victoria spread them on her desk, and her eyes widened as she read. "The Grand Plaza was originally designed by Thomas Harrison and James Martinez," she read aloud. "Martinez? Rosa, was your grandfather named James?" Rosa nodded slowly. "Yes. He was an architect, but he died before I was born. My father never talked about him much." Victoria continued reading, her face growing pale. "According to these papers, James Martinez and Thomas Harrison were business partners. They designed the Grand Plaza together in 1950. But when they went to get financing—" "Let me guess," Rosa said bitterly. "No bank would give a loan to a Mexican architect in 1950. Harrison took the plans to the bank alone," Victoria read. "He got the loan, but he removed Martinez's name from everything. The hotel was built, and Martinez died a few months later, his dream stolen." Rosa sat down hard. "So my grandfather, this was his hotel too?" "More than that," Mrs. Henderson said, pulling out more papers. "According to these letters, Harrison felt so guilty that he left instructions in his will. The hotel was supposed to be jointly owned by both families. But his son Jonathan ignored the will and sold it before anyone could contest it." "He sold it to me," Victoria realized, "and now he's trying to use this story to take it back." Just then, Margaret rushed in. "Mr. Harrison is here. He's in the lobby with reporters." Victoria stood up, straightening her shoulders. "Good, it's time to end this once and for all." In the grand lobby, Jonathan Harrison stood surrounded by cameras and reporters. He was in his 70s now, but still had the smooth charm of old money. "Mrs. Hartley," he smiled coldly as Victoria approached, "ready to discuss terms for returning my family's property?" "You mean the property your family stole from the Martinez family?" Victoria asked loudly. The reporters went silent. "Harrison's," smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I think you do." Victoria nodded to Mrs. Henderson, who started passing out copies of the old documents to reporters. "Your father and James Martinez designed this hotel together. Your father stole the credit, and you ignored his attempt to make it right." Harrison's face turned red. "You can't prove any of this." "Actually, we can." Rosa stepped forward. "I'm Rosa Martinez, James Martinez's granddaughter, and we have all the proof we need." The reporters started shouting questions. Camera flashes went off. Harrison tried to speak, but Victoria raised her voice over the chaos. "I have a proposal," she announced, "one that's 30 years overdue." She turned to Rosa. "Your grandfather helped design this hotel. His dream was stolen from him. I can't change the past, but I can help make it right." She pulled out a document. "This makes you a full partner in the Grand Plaza. 50-50 ownership. What's mine is yours." Rosa stared at the paper in shock. But everything you've built was built on your grandfather's foundation," Victoria said softly. "It's time his name was on the building too." Tears rolled down Rosa's cheeks as she signed the paper. The reporters went wild, cameras flashing. Harrison pushed forward. "You can't do this, I'll sue." "Go ahead," Mrs. Henderson smiled, holding up more documents. "I'm sure the courts would love to hear about how you ignored your father's will." The statute of limitations on fraud, however, Harrison backed away, his face ashen. The reporters followed him, shouting questions about his father's deception. Later that evening, Victoria and Rosa stood in Victoria's office, now their office, looking out at their hotel. "Miguel's going to flip when he hears he's part owner of a hotel," Rosa laughed through tears. "He can run it someday," Victoria smiled. "After he finishes college, of course." They watched the sun setting over the city, its golden light reflecting off the Grand Plaza's windows. "You know what this means?" Rosa asked. "All those years ago, when you saved the hotel with the insurance money, you weren't just saving your dream. You were saving my grandfather's dream too. You just didn't know it." Victoria felt tears in her eyes. "Maybe nothing happens by accident. Maybe I was meant to find out about my mistakes, to learn about pride and humility, so I could finally make things right." The next morning, workers installed a new sign in the lobby. Under the glittering chandelier, it read, "The Grand Plaza Hotel, founded by Thomas Harrison and James Martinez, 1950, restored and renewed by Victoria Hartley and Rosa Martinez, 2025. The hotel staff gathered to see it, applauding as Victoria and Rosa unveiled the sign together. In the crowd, Victoria saw Frank Martinez smiling proudly at his cousin Rosa. She saw Mrs. Henderson showing Mr. Jenkins to a comfortable seat. She saw Miguel, wearing a junior chef's hat, holding up his phone to take pictures. "What happens now?" Rosa asked quietly. "Now," Victoria smiled, "we build something new, together. No more secrets, no more pride. Just honest work and treating people right." "Like a family," Rosa added. "Exactly like a family." As they walked through their hotel together, greeting staff and guests, Victoria felt at peace for the first time in 30 years. The Grand Plaza had been built on a dream that was stolen, rebuilt on a tragedy that was hidden. But now it could become what it was always meant to be, a place where everyone's dreams could come true. Because sometimes it takes losing everything you thought was important to find what really matters. Sometimes you have to fall all the way down to learn how to rise upright. And sometimes, just sometimes, the price of pride turns out to be worth paying if it teaches you the value of humility, truth, and love. The end.